I walked down the familiar creaky stairs of my grandma's basement, my heart pounding. I had called her name repeatedly since entering the house and received no response. Now I was seriously worried something was wrong. My grandma's home had always been my refuge. My dad left years ago, and Mother was an alcoholic and would often disappear for long periods, leaving me to fend for myself. My older brother James was always bullying me, and without a parent there to defend me, things were horrible. For years, I'd gone to my grandma's house as often as I could. I would sit and listen to her play the piano, or we would play board games together. It worked out perfectly because she seemed really lonely. She gave piano lessons, but she said not too many kids were interested in learning piano anymore. She said I was the only person who brought joy to her life. Knowing that made me feel special. Lately, I'd been busy with school, so I hadn't been over as much. She'd seemed so happy when I'd called her this morning to say I was coming over. Now I was freaking out that maybe she'd had a fall and had been lying injured in her house without anyone knowing. I had checked every room upstairs and no sign of her. No notes suggesting that she had gone out on an errand. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I looked around. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My grandma was slumped in a folding chair, ropes binding her, a strip of cloth in her mouth. It looked like something out of a movie. I stood there for a moment, too shocked to move. Then I raced over. "Grandma!" I yelled. I was terrified that she was dead. But as I pulled the cloth from her mouth, she came to. She seemed groggy, and there was a bruise on her cheek. I undid the ropes, asking her frantically what had happened, who had done this to her. At first, she seemed too shocked to speak, but finally she told me she'd been robbed. She said the burglar had taken the TV in her bedroom and some jewelry. I immediately got out my phone to call the police, but she stopped me. "No, Chelsea," she said. "I don't want them involved." "But Grandma, they committed a crime. They could have seriously hurt you. What if I hadn't found you in time?" But she said the police had better things to do than worry about some idiot junkie looking to make a few bucks. That doesn't seem right to me. I asked what the burglar had looked like, and she said he'd worn a mask. Then she got up shakily, went upstairs, and didn't discuss the incident again for the rest of the evening. I tossed and turned all night, thinking how weird it was that my grandma was so casual about being robbed. There had to be some reason she didn't want the police involved. I stopped at her house in the morning before school to check on her. I was relieved to see that the bruise had faded, and she seemed to be feeling better. I went over again after school. I brought her favorite cookies from the bakery and kept asking if there was anything she needed. I felt so guilty about what had happened. I asked again if she remembered anything about the burglar, but again, she didn't want to talk about it. So I did a little investigating. When she would leave a room, I would look around for anything that might clue me in as to what had happened. I noticed that one of her vases in the kitchen was missing, and I found shards of it wrapped in a plastic bag in the trash. So maybe there had been a struggle in the kitchen. But that didn't tell me anything about who the culprit was. Finally, I slipped into her bedroom, where I found her diary. I started reading. She mostly used the diary to write about her piano students. There was one student in particular that she wrote about a lot, and who she'd also mentioned in the past. His name was Trevor, and he was from a terrible family, but was apparently a piano prodigy. I remember he used to hang out with James when they were younger, and even my mom, who was a piece of work herself, said Trevor was bad news and she didn't want my brother hanging out with him anymore. Grandma had mentioned his criminal record before. Suddenly, I had a theory forming. Trevor had robbed my grandma, and she was such a good-hearted soul that she didn't want him sent to jail. No way was I going to let this creep get away with what he had done to my grandma. I put the diary back where I found it just as Grandma started calling for me. I joined her again, already plotting. When I got home, James was smoking weed and playing a new video game. Where he'd gotten the money for the pot or the game was anyone's guess, since he was always complaining he was broke. I almost wanted to tell him what had happened to Grandma and ask for his advice. He and I used to get along when we were younger. We'd share secrets, ride our bikes downtown together. He used to love going to Grandma's house too. But then our dad left, and James had gotten so messed up. I knew even speaking to him tonight would probably prompt a fight, so I just went upstairs. The next day after school, I went to Trevor's house. His mother answered the door in her nightgown, smoking a cigarette. I said that I had a school project to work on with Trevor. She just muttered, "Come in," and yelled for Trevor, then wandered back into the house. When Trevor came to the door, I knew at once that I was right. He'd grown much bigger than he was back when he hung out with my brother. He was definitely strong enough to have attacked my grandma, and he had the insolent look of somebody who didn't care who he hurt. I was scared of him, but my anger was greater than my fear. Once we were alone, I said, "I know what you did to my grandma." He stared at me blankly. "What?" "You heard me," I said. "She might be too nice to press charges, but there is no way you were going to get away with what you did. I want to hear you admit it." "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said. "She was robbed 2 nights ago. I know it was you." "You're crazy, Chelsea." He seemed genuinely confused. Finally, I gave up in frustration. "If you won't confess, then I'll tell the police and they can get the details out of you." He grabbed my arm. "If you go to the cops with your lies, there will be consequences," he said. I yanked my arm away and hurried home. I knew I should go straight to the cops, but I kept thinking how insistent my grandma had been that she didn't want them involved. What if there was something to the story that I was missing? I went to my grandma's. She was pacing around the kitchen. "Where were you?" she demanded. I was startled by her tone. I told her I'd just had to run an errand. She said she'd been scared here alone. I immediately felt terrible. I should have known she needed company right now. I played games with her for the rest of the evening, even though I had homework I should have been doing. When I finally went home, I got a message on social media from Trevor. He said that he was sorry about what had happened to my grandma. He said that he loved her very much and would never do anything to hurt her. He had debated for a long time whether or not to tell me this, but had decided that he should. He said that 2 nights ago, my brother came to his house. They'd gotten high together, and then James had left, telling Trevor that if anyone asked, to say he'd spent the night at Trevor's house. Trevor hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now he wondered. My first instinct was to be insulted. My brother would never do something like that to Grandma. But inside, my heart was thumping. I knew how violent James had become lately, and now he was throwing around money that he hadn't had before. Was it possible? I went to my grandma's house the next morning and asked her point blank, "Was James the one who robbed you?" She looked horrified. I knew it must be true. She hadn't wanted to talk about the crime because she was trying to protect James. I started crying, harder than I'd ever cried before. As much as I didn't get along with James, I didn't want him to go to jail. Then I would have no one, not my dad, not my brother, and my mom only when she felt like being around. "Don't cry," Grandma kept saying to me. "Don't cry, Chelsea. It's not what you think." "I didn't think James could do something this awful." "He didn't," she said quietly. I'd never seen my grandma look so ashamed. I asked her what was going on, and she said she was afraid to tell me, afraid I'd hate her. I felt sick to my stomach. "Just tell me," I begged. She finally told me the truth, that she had staged the robbery. She'd been lonely because I wasn't coming around as much, and she felt like even when I was here, my mind was on other things. School and boys and friendship drama. She felt invisible. So she tied herself to that chair on a day she knew I was coming over, painted the bruise on her cheek, and told me it was a burglary. If I'd thought I was shocked the day I found her in the basement, it was nothing compared to what I felt now. But the more I thought about it, the more I remembered how easily the ropes had come undone. The knots must have been quick release, and the bruise had faded almost immediately because it was makeup. I just couldn't believe that my grandma would hurt me this way. "Do you hate me?" she asked. I told her I needed some space. She was the one person I thought I could rely on, and now I couldn't even trust her. I told her I'd talk to her when I was ready, and then I went home. When I got home, James took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I was worried it was a trick, but I was too upset to care. I blurted out the whole story to him, even the part about suspecting him. When I was done, he was surprisingly sympathetic. He said he couldn't believe the grandma he'd known would do something like that. We talked for a long time, more than we'd talked in years. I guess that's the one good thing to come out of this. James and I have reconnected a little. My relationship with Grandma is still rocky. I don't trust her the way I used to, but I'm spending time with her when I can. James even visited her with me one day. I don't know if things will ever be back to normal, but if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that family relationships are messy. I understand how lonely she must have been to resort to faking a burglary for attention, and she's starting to understand just how much she betrayed me. I hope one day we can rebuild that trust we lost. What do you think of my story? Please leave your comments and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories.